I'd now like to introduce you to our Brenninkmeijer Memorial Lecture speaker, Bishop Kevin Dowling. Bishop Kevin Dowling also has a very special place in the heart of CIE because he was also the chair of our board for many years. He became Bishop of Rustenburg in the Northwest Province in 1990. And he has played a historic role in responding to the impact of HIV, especially in those many deprived, informal settlements around the platinum mines in Rustenburg. Bishop Dowling was instrumental in negotiating the peace process in Sudan, and in 2005 he was heralded by Time magazine as one of 37 heroes changing the world for the better. He is currently co-president of Pax Christi International, a peace-building organization. Please welcome Bishop Kevin Dowling.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that warm welcome, and Biddy Rose for that reflection on Bishop Hans. So good afternoon, everyone, my sisters and brothers and dear friends. It's a great privilege to be with you this afternoon, and I'm blessed to be meeting all of you, many of whom I know and I've encountered in the past. I want to also thank very much CIE for inviting me to be here today and to give the lecture. And I think we need to all express our congratulations and immense gratitude to the whole CIE staff over these past 30 years for their tremendous contribution, dedicated work over the past 30 years in the education project in Southern Africa. We're all indebted to you. My thanks also to Mark Potterton and the whole school community for making this facility available for us today. Brenninkmeijer, I was privileged to take over liaison bishop and chair of the board after he died. That's a memory I will always cherish, those years I spent with CIE. You see the title behind me of the lecture. The principles and values encompassed in the preamble of the South African Constitution state, we as South Africans, as a starting point in our quest for embracing democracy, need to recognize the injustices of the past, heal the divisions of the past, and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. Now, on the basis of this call, I framed the title of this address as a question: social justice, a hope fading away or slipping away? The term social justice is open to many interpretations, but it can remain an academic concept unless it begins from the place and the experience of the poorest and most destitute in societies anywhere in the world. And at the heart of the quest for social justice is the issue of human rights, mentioned in that preamble. But if the powerful elites of our world control how human rights are to be understood, then the ideas and real needs of the poor and how they see human rights being implemented in their reality, that will be excluded. Pope Francis began with that experience of the poor in the favelas of Argentina, and therefore strongly critiques the human rights debate as it occurs today. He affirmed that human rights is not an academic discipline, but a powerful tool for creating a different future. His reflections point to the need for a conversion of heart and spirit, which comes as a result of touching, experiencing the reality of suffering and the impoverishment of people. At the United Nations recently, Pope Francis urged the world community to commit to the common good, to just relationships, and to a vision of human dignity that can only be realized and only be protected in community. He kept on using that phrase, fraternity, which meant his focus on the value and importance of community. And that, of course, is also at the heart of our African worldview of Ubuntu, the communitarian vision of life as the basis for a human rights tradition. This is the opposite of the current liberal model so often realized around the world, where society is understood as an artificial contract between autonomous individuals undertaken for self-interest and for self-advancement, and therefore not for reasons of enabling all to find a place in the sun, and indeed for the planet to be protected so that all might have a place in the sun in the future, especially those who have slipped through the security net. In this regard, Father Albert Nolan made a prophetic call to all of us in the faith-based sector, particularly some years ago, when he said, "Suffering must be the new starting point for modern theology and spirituality." I begin with a story which expresses what he said. It was in late 2003. A little boy named Bongani came into my life. His mother and brother had both died of AIDS-defining diseases in a huge informal settlement where, together with a religious sister, that's Sister Georgina on the left, and Sister Hilda, a nurse, and Bongani, the little boy. Together with them, I began a primary health care clinic in 1997 in that informal settlement. We began by using a small shipping container, and this developed into a major AIDS center and program encompassing the clinic, home care nursing team, an antiretroviral clinic, an OBC center, skills training, a creche, and a primary school in containers for some 600 kids from the Shack settlement, which ran for 6 years, staffed entirely by volunteers, which we closed down when the government built a primary school in the nearby RDP section. Now, the fact that Bongani's mother, a migrant from the Eastern Cape, had died of AIDS-defining diseases was because of an appalling injustice. She fell ill as a result of being forced through utter destitution into transactional sex with the miners from the mine compound next to our center, because that was her only way to survive, except that it opened her to being infected and reinfected with HIV. But at the end of that year, 2003, ARV drugs had not yet been rolled out in South Africa. And our own SACBC PEPFAR program would begin only in 2004. Bongani was very ill because of infections linked to being HIV positive. In 2004, I managed to find some funding. He began ARV treatment. And later on, we were able to receive ARV drugs through the superb program run by the SACBC office and Sister Alison Munro, who is here today. Over the months and following years, Bongani was admitted to our AIDS hospice inpatient unit near my house quite a few times as we fought for his life. We stabilized Bongani and eventually got him into the nearby primary school in the RDP section with uniform, shoes, few food supplements, a child carer, and signed to monitor him on a daily basis, and so on. All the time he was in the care of a gogo, an old lady in a shack. But then, what I think is not sufficiently reflected upon in this pandemic in South Africa, we found he could not manage to adequately comprehend in school. He could not study. He could not assimilate knowledge. An example of the problem of malnutrition, inadequate health care, and childhood diseases compounded by HIV infection, which impacts the education process and the formation of the poor child in this country so severely. CIE some years ago did a project in Limpopo to look at the health issues of children in schools and their impact on education. And the findings gave cause for great concern. Bongani, that's him being stabilized, mirrored this. His physical growth was stunted. His mental development had been retarded by the effects of the diseases and HIV, and eventually he had to give up schooling. We continued to care for him, but then sadly his gogo died, and a cousin came from the Eastern Cape to take him back to that extended family. We gave him and her the referral letters for continual access to ARV drugs down there, but we were very worried about the love and support that he needed, quite apart from the worry about him defaulting if someone didn't make sure he took his drugs every day and ate adequately. Our child care coordinator then went to the Eastern Cape to check on him, found him to have regressed a lot. He was defaulting. And she did what she could and returned. Sometime later, Bongani arrived back somehow in our shack settlement. That's the last photo I have with him. Over time, he began to really get very ill, and we admitted him into the inpatient unit. He went down, and like another little boy on Pometsi in that photo, he died, surrounded by the love and the care of the wonderful staff with whom I've been privileged to work for so many years. And as with 1,500 adults and 19 kiddies, that was the end. For Bongani, that story and his life is a blight on the landscape of South Africa. Every facet of his story was replete with injustice. Social justice, a hope slipping away? The only hope visible in that story was that Bongani was not left to survive alone. He became part of the community of the predominantly women carers with whom I worked in that informal settlement since 1997 and in the hospice. In a small but significant way, our faith-based response created a safety net for his human rights. We were present in that tragic journey until all hope and Bongani slipped away. So dreadfully wrong. But what is even more tragic is that that story is replicated in different ways on a daily basis, many thousands of times across the face of our land and in our poorest communities. Daniel Moynihan wrote the following in an article in America magazine in the United States in 1991. Too many of today's children and adults will reach adulthood unhealthy, illiterate, unemployable, lacking moral direction and a vision of a secure future. Many young people believe they have little to lose by dropping out of school, having a baby in an unmarried as an unmarried teenager, using and selling dangerous drugs and committing crimes, when they lack a sense of hope and the opportunity to get a job, support a family, and become part of the mainstream of society, teenagers are frequently not motivated to avoid dangerous or self-destructive behaviors. That was in 1991. Does his analysis not also reflect the current situation in South Africa? Above all, the growing anger of the younger generation, whose sense of hopelessness is translated into different forms of dysfunctional and antisocial behaviors. Among them, drug abuse, violence against the other, whoever that other may be, as in gender-based violence, and engaging in multiple concurrent sexual relationships, partnerships, which fuel the AIDS pandemic. Now, looking just at that reality of AIDS in this country, backed up by research, particularly on the vulnerable young adult group, the prevailing attitude from research would seem to be, well, I have no job, there is no hope of getting a job, there is nothing to live for. So why should I bother about whether or not I become infected? Even more sadly, analyzing that attitude, the lack of a consciousness of a moral responsibility for the life of the other, in this case, the sexual partner. One of the startling statistics contained in the report on crime, which was released in Parliament last week, was the fact that 49 murders were committed by children, not youth, but children. What that translates to in terms of our care and the needs of children and the utter vulnerability of children also points to the fact that there is a priority, an absolute priority, to ensure that children are the primary beneficiaries of a human rights dispensation. We need to make a preferential option for them, the little children, because they truly are the poorest of the poor. Recently, Pope Francis said, I think of so many children who are hungry, abandoned, taken advantage of, forced into war, rejected. It is sad to see the images of unhappy children with a dismayed look that run from war and conflict, knocking on our doors and on our hearts, asking for our help. CIE has always had a very special care for children and their future, and that is at the center of CIE's mission. Promoting and committing to the holistic education, formation, and development of the unique child in their total social context. In a very real way, therefore, CIE and its mission is engaged in a quest to protect and enhance the future of all of us and of our society. Children of today become young adults and adults. They become decision makers of tomorrow, and thus what we do now or what we do not do with them and for them will determine our contribution to the future. That invitation from God is at the heart of our celebration this evening, the mission of CIE in collaboration with all like-minded people and groups. It must be enhanced. It must be sustained so that CIE and all of us and all of those who share in its mission can journey even further, even while we remain all too aware of the constraints of the present funding climate for the NGO sector in particular. Poverty, inequality, unemployment, race and class divisions, social and economic exclusion. Those are the words we constantly hear from analysts in South Africa, but not only here, indeed in many contexts of our globalized world. These words are attempts to articulate our experience of a global reality in which more and more become and are excluded. Example, the refugee crisis recently in Europe. These little ones of our world belong to many diverse groups of people from many different situations, and they are often permanently looking in, but always from the outside. That is at the heart of my concern in this address tonight. I will try to share my thoughts on the basis of my own personal experience and questioning of the reality of those who are the truly poor and destitute of our land, who number around 8.2 million. Social justice, a hope slipping away? I phrased that theme as a question in the hope that as a faith-based group, present and engaged in societal issues like education, healthcare, and other social services, we do have something to contribute to turning around the suffering which is before us, something to contribute in partnership with a range of role players, including government, but only if government allows us to enter into partnerships and can make the contribution we can make, especially at the local and district levels. Firstly, I want to affirm that there are indeed a huge number of people, of citizens, who share very positive stories and experiences of reaching out, of sharing with, of making a difference, which so-called ordinary citizens are responsible for. They are anything but ordinary, because in the hearts and spirit of these caring citizens, they have felt a bond with those who are suffering and marginalized, and are moved to respond in many different ways with real compassion and dedication. And I want to salute them. And I have been privileged to work with them for so many years. Secondly, since 1994, there have been many notable achievements by government, which they articulate very often. For example, the rolling out of electricity to millions. We won't talk about load shedding. Water, housing, new schools, clinics, infrastructure, and so forth. Lots of things. The story since 1994 indeed contains some very impressive achievements, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, even with its problems. The excellent work in terms of ongoing and progressive legislation at Parliament level, national level. The Constitutional Court, the Chapter 9 institutions, the fact that we have an independent judiciary and a free media, and so on. And the coming to birth of a culture of constitutionalism. But after the year around 2000 or thereabouts, optimism has begun perhaps to wane because of several factors, and social cohesion is suffering because of slow socio-economic progress which has not yet begun to dent the reality experienced by the truly poor of our land. The ANC government, quite apart from its internal problems, inherited a state system and a bureaucracy which they have worked on, which has proved or is proving still to be inadequate in the face of significant population growth, the enormity of problems resulting from poverty and inequality, the shrinking economy and growing unemployment, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, increasing desperation and violence, and the influx over the years of millions of political and economic refugees, something that is going to grow. But the questions still have to be faced in in spite of the successes? Why are there so many constant service delivery protests all over the country, many of them involving violence and the destruction of property, including buildings which are crucial to the survival of very poor communities, for example, schools and clinics? Outside observers looking in on this ask the question, is that not insane behavior? The deep-seated anger in so many, therefore, has to be analyzed. Why? The causes and the reasons for this. And a partial explanation is that the anger of so many in this country that they feel after 21 years of democracy is the painful truth that the greatest injustice is for a people or group to be actively treated or passively abandoned as if they were non-members of the human race. Again, why are labor disputes so often characterized by violence, even murder, and massive intimidation, where innocent communities and the actual real poor and unemployed are victimized by these workers and constantly made to live in fear during strikes, as I have personally experienced in the mining area where I work? I could tell you horrendous stories and examples of this, but I don't have the time here. Now, these and many other questions and experiences need analysis, and they need honest debate. But the poorest, the hopeless, the abandoned must be the starting point in any discussion, not ideologies. The point I'm trying to make is that social justice can only truly exist when the quality of life of all individuals, families, and communities in South Africa, but particularly those who are excluded from a place in the sun, has improved to a point where they can experience a life with adequate dignity and hope for the future, and whereby the potential of each person, their family, and their communities is unlocked. Now, the South African National Planning Commission highlighted 9 key challenges facing South Africa in this quest for social justice. Too few South Africans in work. The quality of school education for most black people is substandard. Poorly located and inadequate infrastructure limits social inclusion and faster economic growth. Spatial challenges continue to marginalize the poor. South Africa's growth path is highly resource intensive and hence unsustainable. The ailing public health system confronts a massive disease burden. The performance of the public sector service is uneven. Corruption undermines state legitimacy and service delivery. And South Africa remains a divided society. The National Planning Commission. There is no doubt that for us, meaningful dialogue and engagement about all those issues is possible, and it's even fruitful at the level of the national government, as relationships and work of our Catholic Parliamentary Office with Parliament and its institutions and politicians has shown for many years. High-level church meetings in the past with ministers like Kada Asmal, Naledi Pandor, and Trevor Manuel were positive experiences. A few weeks ago, 7 of us, including Bishop Sandri here and myself, 4 bishops, the SACBC Secretary General and Associate, and representatives of CIE, REAP, and CPLO met the Minister of Higher Education, Blade Nzimande, and his senior colleagues. The 2-hour discussion on the 7th of September with Minister Nzimande was fruitful, and there was an honest sharing on the challenges being encountered in that arena of life. Among them, the fact that Treasury just cannot provide the higher education ministry with enough finance for the programs that are needed. He focused on the important need which CIE and the Tabiso Skills Institute are already engaged in, education and skills training centers, and the opportunity which he focused on to open community colleges in the future for this purpose in deprived communities, to give education and skills training. Something that one of our brothers in Rustenburg, Brother Joseph Kiley, in our diocese did in the mid-90s, a community college in a deprived community. But where is the finance to come from? As I see it from personal experience, the fundamental issue, the fundamental challenge or problem, whatever way you name it, is that the transformation that is required in our country, whether it be in healthcare, education, social security, development, or whatever, has to happen at the provincial and local level. And that is where very often the logjam, the mismanagement, the incompetency, the corruption, fraud, and everything else, and the consequent lack of sustainable delivery to the poorest and the most vulnerable citizens happens at the local level. Another issue is that what national government has called for, whether in the National Development Plan articulated by Minister Trevor Manuel, or the plan of Dr. Aaron Motswaledi from the National Department of Health, namely, bringing together government, business, and all sectors of civil society, including the faith communities, into a social compact and partnership in view of sharing the particular strengths and gifts of those sectors to address the critical issues on the ground, but together. Well, at provincial, but much more so at local level, such a social compact is not yet happening, is not working. But often because of political obstructionism and incompetence, as I personally experienced in the area of the diocese where I minister in the Northwest Province. And perhaps one needs to accept that at provincial level and particularly at local municipality level, especially in the rural areas, there are just not enough skilled and experienced personnel needed to manage what are complex programs. And therefore, time needs to be given to the provincial and local authorities to grow into the required skills level and competencies. But then, how long can the despairing wait for the social justice which actually makes a difference to their quality of life and hope for the future? As Pope Francis said to the meeting of social movements in Bolivia, the first task is to put the economy at the service of people. Human beings and nature must not be at the service of money. Let us say no to an economy of exclusion and inequality, where money rules rather than service. That economy kills, that economy excludes, that economy destroys Mother Earth. Compounding our challenges in South Africa is the present major downturn in the economy. It is limping, if not stalling. Some analysts and recently the IMF have recently downgraded their growth forecast for South Africa to 1.4% in 2015 and 1.2% in 2016. And such a continual lack of growth plus a limited tax base makes it virtually impossible for Minister Nene, the Minister of Finance, to support all the programs which can begin to really turn around poverty systematically and sustainably. Towards the end of August, the head of Stats South Africa, Pali Lechlochla, gave us even more depressing news that our gross domestic product had shrunk by 1.3% in the previous second quarter. Even the National Development Plan, which was supposed to chart the way forward out of these problems, cannot come up with a definitive way out of this crisis, because the different sectors, the different actors differ so strongly on what is required. As National Planning Commission member Mohammed Karan pointed out, business and labor are at odds about the way forward. And it seems to me that the so-called relationship between capital and business and the labor sector is inherently conflictual and characterized by serious tensions. Karan from the National Planning Commission said the country had already done the easier to do interventions, such as redistributing money and the assets such as housing. The challenge, he said, is now to embark on more sustainable actions that would have a greater impact on growth and poverty reduction, including broadening the reach of quality education and creating work for unskilled people. A tough conversation needed to be had, he said, about the role of unions in the education system. Now, this is a man from the National Planning Commission. As he said, this was a hindrance to the skilling of South Africa's future workforce. This is not to imply that there is a dearth of dedicated teachers around the country, but we have all experienced the problem with unions, even in our Catholic school sector. For example, using political connections for promotions and appointments as principals. I once visited one of our principals at a school in the morning. She told me that SATU had called out all the teachers to a meeting the following morning at 9 a.m. She said that meant that there would be no teaching whatsoever the next day, and she added that this happened on a regular basis. A certain Sidwell Tsiginlane from Rockville, Soweto, wrote to the Star newspaper on the 17th of September, and he said very forcefully, SATU is the worst thing to ever happen to a black child in this country. They are literally consigning children to permanent poverty. Perceptions. Perceptions are sometimes stronger than facts, SATU needs to realize. And sometimes perceptions are very much based on facts. Gauteng Education MEC Panyaza Lesufi, speaking about the need to create post-apartheid schools in the townships, also remarked that the appointment of principals and deputies needs to be looked at again. Membership of a political party, street committee, or union, he said, should not guarantee someone to be a principal. But will decisive action be taken? Karan said, research shows that the more unionized the education sector, the lower the outcomes. To that I would add my observation. What about the primary prerequisite? A sense of calling. Is there any sense of calling in many of our teachers, especially in the state education sector? And this very same holds true for nurses in the healthcare sector and all those in the social services sector. One only has to listen to the real poorest in our society and what they actually experience at state hospitals and clinics. We indeed have a very serious problem. And it does not respond to the dignity and worth of these very poor individuals. Karan added that inasmuch as the upskilling of the workforce was imperative, not too much to dent the current unemployment crisis. We need to create jobs, he said, where the unemployed are at the level of the skills of the unemployed. Hence, Minister Nzimanda's focus on community colleges. He added farming is one of those areas. Now, there might be problems there, but nonetheless, farmers can be part of the solution. if they think creatively and behave differently. Like that wine farmer in the Cape who sold part of his property to his workers, trained them in financial management so that now they shared the farm and the workers gained extra income while working for themselves on their land and working for the farmer, the owner of the farm. Surely that example could be replicated all over South Africa, if only people would think out of the box. Stellenbosch University's economic management dean, Stan du Plessis, painted a very bleak picture also of another very serious problem. He said a big question that had to be answered was why private corporations were not investing in business expansion. Some estimates talk about 1 trillion rand being held, being kept by such companies. While low demand and the absence of skilled labor was cited as some of the reasons in recent years, the deterioration of the so-called political climate has emerged as the key reason corporations were not investing in growth in their very own sector, with the possibility, therefore, that more jobs could be created. Deputy Finance Minister Nkabisi Jonas bemoaned the polarization of the economic debate, saying it was constraining the search for solutions. The debate is too ideological, he said. I would suggest the public discourse and debate on many issues is mired in ideological division, which hampers a meaningful encounter and a meaningful dialogue between parties. And what makes this all the more difficult is the fact that South African society across the board is still characterized to a large extent by race and class division, with examples of racism constantly being cited or alleged. Sometimes in my encounters with local politicians, I get an impression, from the nonverbals, that discussions and collaborative action on critical issues in the area are hampered because those discussions are filtered through the lens of who, white or black, is offering an opinion or an observation, and opportunities to make progress are thus missed. Pope Francis, on this issue, speaking last month to the youth in Cuba, said this: a path of hope calls for a culture of encounter, dialogue, which can overcome conflict and sterile confrontation. To create that culture, it is vital to see different ways of thinking, not in terms of risk, but of richness and growth. But in the larger scheme of things in South Africa, diversity does not yet appear to me to be a value through which to enrich each other and work together as a social compact to address our issues together and find solutions together on the basis of shared values and personal and community skills. Rather, the focus is on difference and the resulting division and even threat to me or to us. For example, in the migrancy challenge, our xenophobic attacks, and consequently the incapacity to meaningfully chart a way forward together. Steve Biko gave us the vision for this way forward together when he wrote, "We regard our living together not as an unfortunate mishap, warranting endless competition among us, but as a deliberate act of God to make us a community of brothers and sisters, jointly involved in the quest for a composite answer to the varied problems of life." If we are going to achieve true or real social justice, that is, transformation of poverty and inequality, we will need to think and act and behave differently instead of ideologically. And as a faith-based group, our church needs to critique, to engage, to commit to the vision of a social compact as called for in the National Development Plan, and to bring to the discourse and debate principled thinking and values, transformative and transcendent values, which must inform the practical initiatives, hopefully with government. The encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si', is a perfect example of transcendent values infusing that particular debate, and therefore taking it to another level altogether. In some of his talks in the USA, Pope Francis noted that change in personal attitudes as well as social transformation can only happen in an environment of encounter and dialogue. And surely that is the only way forward for us if South Africa can move forward in the quest for social justice for the poor and marginalized, not only in partnerships with government and other stakeholders, but with the poor and the destitute themselves, who need to be motivated and empowered to become agents of change in their situation. But if the elites in a society control the agenda, the dialogue, and the outcomes, directions and decisions will not really transform the reality of the poorest, because they will be excluded from the dialogue. Paul Graham and Alice Coetzee suggest that the best index for examining the degree of democracy in any country is to interrogate two questions: the extent to which citizens can control those who make collective decisions about public affairs, and the extent to which citizens are equal to each other in this process. But to work with, inspire, and capacitate destitute and poor communities in view of building their own agency is no easy task, which I've experienced in so many times in the vortex of survival and struggle, particularly in the informal settlements. It is no easy task at all. It requires patience and perseverance when we in the faith-based sector seek to enter into a dialogue and partnership with the real poor. It also requires of us a refusal to give up on the ideals and the values we in the faith-based sector hold to. Now, in conclusion, I would like to focus on three interfacing values or principles of Catholic social teaching, which should inspire and guide our collective efforts in whatever sphere of life and experience we engage in as church, whether education or healthcare, social services, but especially in terms of our quest to contribute to the outcomes of social justice so that it does not become a hope that slips away from the poorest and most destitute in our society. Firstly, sorry, I didn't turn that on. Just you can look at those again. So firstly, solidarity. Pope Francis, again in Cuba, said this: the culture of encounter should naturally lead to a culture of solidarity. Without solidarity, no country has a future. Simple tolerance is not enough. We have to go well beyond that, passing from a suspicious and defensive attitude to one of acceptance, cooperation, concrete service, and effective assistance, so that no one is excluded from the path. Now, the objective of being in solidarity with the poorest and marginalized in our society is so that the common good becomes an achievable goal. For that to happen in South Africa at present, with endemic poverty, huge inequality, and unemployment, what is needed is a profound inner conversion in the hearts and spirit of people and entire sectors of the society, and especially those who are in privileged positions both in the public and private sector. The inner conversion is required because without it, we will not move on to the next step, which is simply good old-fashioned self-sacrifice for the good of others, the common good. There can be no justification at all for the elites and those who live at an obscene level of economic prosperity, while 17 million of our people depend on social grants in order to survive, merely to survive. Is there any sign that the political and economic elites in this country are ready to sacrifice and to share even from their excess? As Pope Francis told his Bolivian audience, once capital becomes an idol and guides people's decisions, once greed for money presides over the entire socio-economic system, it ruins society. It condemns and enslaves men and women. It sets people against one another. And as we clearly see, it even puts our common home at risk. It seems to me that we have quite a way to go in South Africa before we reach the ideal of living simply so that others may simply live. And the objective in living and acting in solidarity for the common good is so that the poorest and most vulnerable in our society can be empowered to become agents of change in their situation through that third Catholic social teaching principle, namely subsidiarity. Subsidiarity must be the spirit which breathes through any form of partnership in the quest to achieve a viable and a sustainable social compact in this country. The principle of subsidiarity holds that outside resources coming in will be more effective if local people are themselves investing in and mobilizing their own resources and are able to actually set the agenda for outside help on the basis of their strengths rather than their weaknesses. Subsidiarity therefore calls for an approach where the higher level does not interfere with or block what can be done at the lower level. It is a call for decentralized decision-making and practice. Partnerships with the poorest and marginalized community by government, business, unions, all civil society organizations, including the faith-based sector, must be orientated towards a vision of social and economic development which partners, which accompanies, which actually enables the poorest in society to use and to enhance what they have, however small that may be, so that they can be active participants in achieving the change which will hopefully ensure a life of adequate dignity and hope. That is not to say at all that it is easy. It is not. As Pope Benedict XVI wrote in Caritas in Veritate, in development programs, the principle of the centrality of the human person as the subject primarily responsible for development must be preserved. The people who benefit from them, from the development programs, ought to be directly involved in their planning and implementation. Again, no easy quest. Several, if not many of you, are engaged in the education sector, and perhaps in the health and other service sectors. In addition to the many commendable examples of solidarity and support which our school communities have committed to over many years in partnership with more deprived school communities, perhaps we in the church sector, together with our partners in government, business, and the civic sector, need to think more and more out of the box so that partners can start to imagine more creatively and differently, and hopefully find additional ways to meet the needs of the poorest communities and schools and the further education and skills sector? Could our Better Off schools, for example, to help to replicate that healthcare program in rural poor communities as was done by CIE in Limpopo? Can we in the church sector, in our education ministry, look more creatively at how we can contribute to the systemic changes which are needed to transform the reality on the ground in the more deprived schools? The same holds true for the health, skills training, and social service sectors. We need to be looking for where are the gaps in delivery, the lacunae in meeting real needs, the underperformance of those responsible, the lack of a sense of calling, and so on. And how we can promote agency and change in respectful partnerships. I'm very well aware that our staffs are already stretched and overstretched and spend many hours, extra hours, in the quest for delivering quality and holistic education. Time and resources are limited, but I simply invite imagination and taking small steps forward. And surely, we have immensely gifted and creative educationists in the church sector, in the skills training and healthcare sectors. This is at the heart of what Catholic social teaching has promoted, what we term integral human development, which involves the whole person in their total human situation. Integral human development is the starting point on the journey towards true and life-giving social justice. Finally, Pope Francis gave me the overall vision for this address when he said this in Bolivia: a just economy must create the conditions for everyone to be able to enjoy a childhood without want, to develop their talents when young, to work with full rights during their active years, and to enjoy a dignified retirement as they grow older. My question: do many of the poorest and most vulnerable in our society have any hope of that happening to their families and communities during their lifetime? So, social justice, a hope slipping away? What do you think?